As far back as I can remember, I always wanted to be a gangster.
When Goodfellas was released, it changed how the world saw organized crime, blending real events with unforgettable storytelling to create one of the most respected mafia films ever made. Directed by Martin Scorsese and based on the life of Henry Hill, it felt raw, authentic, and real. But behind that realism, there are details that were changed, simplified, or completely altered. And when you separate the movie from the truth, the real story becomes darker, more complex, and far less cinematic than what audiences remember. Part 1. Henry Hill, not as powerful as he seemed. At the center of the story is Henry Hill, whose narration in the film creates the impression that he was deeply embedded within the Mafia structure, moving confidently among powerful figures and playing a central role in major operations. But the reality of his position was far more limited and far more fragile than what the film suggests. Hill was never a made man, never formally initiated into the Mafia due to his Irish heritage. And that fact alone placed a permanent ceiling on his status, meaning that no matter how involved he became in criminal activity, he would always remain an associate, dependent on the protection and approval of those above him. This distinction matters because it reshapes how his entire story should be viewed, turning what appears in the film as a rise through the ranks into something closer to a long-term attachment to power without ever truly possessing it. His access to information, his involvement in decisions, and his ability to influence outcomes were all limited by this position, even if the film presents those limitations in a less obvious way. Over time, Hill's own retelling of events, particularly after becoming an informant, introduced elements of exaggeration and simplification, not necessarily to deceive, but to create a narrative that was coherent, engaging, and aligned with his role as the central storyteller, which means that while his story is based in truth, it is not a complete or perfectly accurate reflection of the reality he lived. Part 2. James Burke. More than just a charismatic crew leader. The character portrayed as Jimmy Conway in the film is based on James Burke, and while the movie presents him as a charismatic, approachable figure with a dangerous side, the reality is that Burke was far more calculating, far more controlling, and far more dangerous than what is fully shown on screen. He wasn't simply reacting to situations or participating in crimes. He was organizing them, managing people, and making decisions that required both foresight and a willingness to eliminate threats when necessary. His ability to maintain control over his crew came not just from respect, but from fear, because those around him understood that his calm demeanor could shift quickly if he believed his position was at risk. The Lufthansa heist, one of the most significant events tied to his name, was not just a bold robbery, but a carefully orchestrated operation that required coordination, planning, and trust among multiple individuals. And the aftermath of that heist was far more prolonged and complex than what the film presents. The wave of paranoia that followed, including the elimination of individuals connected to the crime, was not an immediate reaction, but a gradual process shaped by increasing pressure and a desire to reduce exposure, reflecting a level of strategic thinking that goes beyond the more simplified version shown in the film. Thomas DeSimone, the reality behind the character. The character presented in Goodfellas as an unpredictable and violent enforcer is based on Thomas DeSimone, and while the film captures certain aspects of his personality, it still presents a version of him that is more controlled and more contained than the reality, because the true extent of DeSimone's behavior was far more extreme and far less predictable than what could reasonably be shown within the limits of a mainstream film. In real life, DeSimone had a reputation for sudden, often unprovoked violence that made even other criminals wary of him, not because violence itself was unusual in that environment, but because his actions often lacked the restraint and calculation that typically guided how and when force was used. He was known to escalate situations quickly, to act without fully considering the consequences, and to create problems that others then had to manage, which, over time, contributed to a growing perception that he was becoming a liability rather than an asset. His alleged involvement in the murders of individuals connected to powerful mafia figures, including actions that may have crossed organizational boundaries, increased the pressure surrounding him, because those kinds of violations carried consequences that extended beyond personal disputes and into the broader structure of organized crime. The film simplifies his story, presenting a more direct cause and effect path leading to his disappearance. But the reality is believed to involve a combination of factors, including accumulated behavior, rising tensions, and the need to address a problem that could no longer be ignored, ultimately leading to his disappearance in 1979 under circumstances that remain uncertain but are widely believed to have been fatal. Part 4. The Lufthansa Heist. Far more complex than the film shows. The Lufthansa heist is often remembered as one of the most dramatic moments in the film, but what audiences see is a condensed version of an operation that in reality was far more complex, involving a wider network of individuals, more detailed planning, and a level of coordination that extended beyond what can be fully explored within the constraints of a single storyline. The heist itself required inside information, precise timing, and the ability to move quickly while avoiding detection, and its success was not just the result of boldness, but of preparation and execution at multiple levels. The aftermath, which the film portrays through a series of rapid developments, was in reality a prolonged period of tension, where decisions were made carefully and often quietly, as those involved attempted to manage the risks associated with such a high-profile crime. The elimination of certain individuals connected to the heist was not simply a matter of immediate suspicion, but part of a broader effort to reduce long-term exposure, reflecting a level of calculation that is difficult to fully convey in a film focused on pacing and narrative flow. Part 5. The Lifestyle. More pressure than power. One of the most lasting impressions left by Goodfellas is the sense of excitement and reward associated with life in organized crime, particularly in the early stages of the story, where the focus is on money, status, and access, creating an image that is both compelling and influential. However, this portrayal places emphasis on the visible benefits while minimizing the constant pressure that existed beneath the surface, because in reality, life within that world was defined by uncertainty, risk, and the understanding that stability was often temporary. Relationships were influenced by shifting alliances. Decisions were shaped by the need to manage both internal and external threats, and the consequences of mistakes could be severe and immediate, creating an environment where even moments of success were accompanied by an underlying awareness of potential loss. The film eventually moves into the darker aspects of this lifestyle, but the reality is that those aspects were present throughout, influencing behavior and decisions in ways that are not always fully visible on screen. Henry Hill's decline: longer, messier, and more unstable. The depiction of Henry Hill's decline into drug use and paranoia is one of the most intense parts of the film, but it represents a condensed version of a much longer and more complicated period in his life, where addiction, legal pressure, and internal instability combined to create a situation that was far more chaotic than what is shown. His involvement in drug trafficking introduced additional risks, both legally and within the structure of the Mafia, where such activities were often discouraged or restricted due to the attention they attracted, and this added layer of tension contributed to the breakdown of his position within the organization. The paranoia that defined this period was not limited to a single sequence of events, but was an ongoing condition shaped by the realities of his situation, including the increasing likelihood of arrest and the awareness that his relationships within the criminal world were becoming less stable. Part 7. Witness protection: no clean ending. The transition into witness protection is presented in the film as a kind of conclusion, emphasizing the contrast between Hill's former life and his new reality. But in truth, this transition did not provide the sense of closure that the narrative suggests, because the challenges associated with leaving that world behind extended far beyond the initial relocation. Hill's life after cooperating with authorities was marked by ongoing difficulties, including struggles with addiction, legal issues, and the challenge of adapting to a lifestyle that lacked the structure and identity he had known for so long. Witness protection did not erase his past. It simply changed the environment in which he had to live with it, creating new pressures and new complications that continued to shape his life long after the events depicted in the film. Part 8. The Mafia: more structure, more rules, more consequences. While Goodfellas provides glimpses into the structure of organized crime, it focuses primarily on individual experiences, which can create the impression that the system itself is more flexible and less regulated than it actually was. In reality, the Mafia operated with a defined hierarchy, established rules, and clear expectations regarding behavior, loyalty, and decision-making. And these structures influenced every aspect of how individuals interacted within the organization. Deviations from these expectations carried consequences that were not always immediate, but were often inevitable, shaping the long-term outcomes of those involved. By simplifying this structure, the film makes the story more accessible, but it also removes some of the complexity that defined the real organization, including the balance between autonomy and control that governed its operations. Goodfellas remains one of the most influential crime films ever made, not because it tells the full truth, but because it captures enough of that truth to feel real, while shaping it into a narrative that audiences can follow and remember. The real story is more detailed, more complicated, and often more unsettling, revealing a world that cannot be fully understood through a single perspective or a single retelling, and reminding us that even the most realistic portrayals are still interpretations of events that were far more complex than what can be shown on screen.